Well, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your holiday. This is the lecture for Wednesday of week 3. This is the last lecture in sort of the first unit of our course. So it's still going to concern, right, model that we have for analyzing scientific episodes and applying it. Here we're applying it to um, scientific episodes that we're not sure how to classify. Are they scientific or not, right? Is this traditional distinction between science and pseudoscience? And in philosophy, there's been some ink spilled over how to carve that up. These authors have their own particular take on it, which is a reasonable take. Again, if you're looking for like philosophy of science stuff, this text, they sort of like assume their own philosophy of science and say this is how we're doing it, and it's a perfectly reasonable uh, philosophy of science. So unless you're like really want to get into the weeds, there's no reason to disagree with it. Um, so as far as the course, yeah, after watching this lecture, um, following Monday, we will have a live Zoom lecture, right? So I sent out an announcement, but it's worth reiterating it here. Um, Given the circumstances, I think the best option course is to take the whole course online for the rest of the quarter. There's just too much uncertainty going on. In my experiences, uh, I do have to make some kind of online uh, version of the course available for people who just can't be in the country and so on, or for people who right get sick and can't come to class for a while. And once that option is up there, it seems to me the vast majority of students will take it. Um, so in that case, it just doesn't seem worth the returns to do a hybrid course. I generally prefer to be in person, but it just doesn't seem like it's practical right now. So we're online for the duration. So that means that on Monday, um, we had a review section uh, scheduled, right? We were just going to sort of talk over, get prepare for the exam that's going to be coming up um, a week from now, right, on next Wednesday. So I'm going to do that one live. I don't think it makes sense to post a YouTube video. You've seen me talk about this stuff. Now we need to interact, and I need to be able to answer your questions. Hopefully I think your discussions have been going well from what I've heard from the TAs, but it doesn't hurt to review a bit more. So I will see you all Monday live on Zoom, and that one counts for attendance, right? I'll have the quiz, um, so it's not like a one you can skip. Right. So that's that. So on to so the point of this lecture in this chapter in the text uh, is to show how this method for analyzing scientific episodes also works for episodes where you're not entirely sure if they're scientific or not, really. Um, and the the idea behind that is like rather than trying to devise some independent criterion of what science versus pseudoscience, many have been proposed right through the history of philosophy of science, and they're controversial. Um, these authors are doubtful whether, in the end, you'll really be able to formulate one, right? Sort of a strict rule that says anything that satisfies this is science, and anything that doesn't isn't, right? For example, like you might want to say one thing that's been thrown out there is like, well, science involves experiments. If there's no experiments, there's no science. And astrophysics doesn't involve experiments where you manipulate a variable, right? We're just observing the movement of planets and the stars and so on. So that's not strictly speaking an experiment because you're not manipulating the stars, right? So um, nonetheless, I think we'd all want to say astrophysics is science, right? So rather than sort of get bogged down in that debate, um, they're saying we can use our same method, right, our same model, and apply it to any episode, whether or not we're sure it's science, and it's still going to work, right? All it's going to tell us is there good evidence, right, for this hypothesis or not? And we will find that stuff that's questionable, we're going to call it marginal science rather than pseudoscience, right, to allow for the possibility that I don't know, maybe it is science, maybe it's not. We don't have to take a hard stand on that. But the stuff that's like probably not science, right, that's marginal, is going to tend to produce inconclusive results at the end of our 6 steps. So the only thing that we do require, right? It's just not going to even count as something we can analyze if it doesn't have some kind of model and some kind of data, right? So anything that just doesn't even have a model or data is not going to count as scientific. We're not going to be able to apply our method of analysis. But anything that has at least that, we can at least um, analyze it, and if it turns out inconclusive, it's there's a possibility that it's just marginal science at best. So most of this lecture is going to be taken up just by covering two of the examples in the text. There's um, more examples in the text, and I encourage you to read it and discuss it in discussion, but I won't sort of like it'll get a little repetitive, so I'm not going to force you to watch um, the longest YouTube video ever where I describe each of these. So we're going to cover Freudian psychology and astrology. So status of Freud had a psychological theory, right? It's still under a matter of debate whether it's counts as science, right, or whether it's anything about it is true. Um, but there are still psychoanalysts out there, right? Freudian psychoanalysts. They still treat patients. There are even journals that specialize in Freudian tradition, right, and still publish work. I have encountered it in my work because there's something that's in mainstream psychology called reality testing, which is like the how you tell the difference between uh, perception and like imagination or memory, right? Almost like the vast majority of the time, right, when I see this computer before me, I know I'm not imagining it, I know I'm seeing it, but it's actually sort of a interesting question how we accomplish that so well most of the time. At any rate, that term, reality testing, I guess, originates in Freudian psychoanalysis. So those journals are out there, and I've even intersected with them. But nonetheless, it's not really, I wouldn't call it mainstream, right? I don't think my department would be thrilled with me doing a PhD thesis in Freudian psychology. Okay, so Sigmund Freud, born in 1856, died in 1939, right? So he was late 1800s, early 1900s. He was doing most of his work. Um, he was studying medicine, neurophysiology, right? So he had some knowledge of the brain. And then he sort of started his own practice where he treated patients with nervous disorders. So they knew there was some mental problem, some brain problem. And sort of developed his own theory from working with these patients. So Freud's model of the mind, um, there's a few different structures, right? And each has its own characteristics. So we'll cover two of the structures. So one structure in his model of the mind consists of three parts. So there's the unconscious mind, which is sort of covered by my head here, but it's sort of the larger part, right? It's sort of the bulk of the iceberg is underneath the surface. Um, Unconscious meaning we don't, right? It's our mind grinding away, doing all these calculations, doing what it does, and it's just not, we don't experience it, right, at all. There's the conscious mind, which is what you are actually experiencing at any moment, right? Your thoughts and your sensations and just the stuff you have access to. And then sort of in the middle is this preconscious mind, which is typically unconscious but can be made conscious if you sort of pause and try to attend to it, right? Um, so that's one structure, right? And it's sort of defined in terms of awareness. You have the parts of your mind you are unaware of, the parts of the mind you are aware of, and the parts of your mind you could become aware of, right? The other structure in Freud's model, uh, another, is again three tripartite, right? It consists of the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is your sort of primitive biological desires that you're sort of driven to fulfill, and when you do fulfill them, they produce pleasure. Eating, sex, things like this, right? Homer Simpson is kind of like an unconstrained id, right? Just does whatever he wants to at any moment. And then on the sort of the other side, on the very top, is the superego, right? And the superego is like comes from society. It's all these social rules of behavior, right? What are you supposed to do? Right? What are other people want you to do? So maybe it's something like your conscience. I think it's maybe even a bit more sort of socially dictated than your conscience or like what you feel is right in your heart. It's more like what do people expect of you? Right? And then the ego is in between, and it sort of like negotiates between these two, right? So it's taking in the desires of the id, but it's also aware of the superego, that you can't always pursue all those desires, and it's sort of like negotiating between the two and producing your behavior. And you can see it here sort of mapped onto the conscious, preconscious, unconscious um, division. So the id is largely unconscious, so you can see a little corner of it popping up into consciousness. The superego largely conscious, so you can see it, a little corner of it down in the unconscious, and the ego sort of straddling the two. So for our purposes for now, and I'm not a Freudian scholar, so about the extent that I know about it too, and this will be enough for us to sort of practice applying our model to, again, a model that it's not clear whether it's going to count as mainstream science anymore. Okay, so how does this model apply? Let's apply it to child development, right? This is, again, Freud's applications were broad and large, but let's focus in on one area. So Freud thinks that young children, right, they've not really developed their superego yet. They're primarily ruled by the id. I have a 2-year-old, and that's fairly true. She does what she wants. If she doesn't get what she wants, she screams and cries. Too concerned about what other people think of her. Um, According to Freud, young boys and girls will form Oedipal or electric complexes. So they initially form an attachment to the parent of the opposite sex and reject the other. So little boys will, right, be more attached to their mothers. Little girls will be more attached to their fathers, according to Freud. Um, and as they develop, right, develop their superego and learn what society demands of them, they have to learn to switch that up and begin to identify with the parent of the same sex, right, so they can adopt that social role, right? Certainly in Freud's time was pretty rigid. It's loosening up now, but it's still fairly rigid, right? So little girls are supposed to copy their mothers ultimately and act like women, right? And little boys their fathers. That process, Freud says, is difficult, right? The id, for whatever reason, drives the little boy towards his mother, and then society's telling him, nope, nope, you gotta be more like your father. And so the difficulty of that process, um, stressful, and we develop these sort of mental defense mechanisms to deal with the stress. So what we start to do is repress the id, right? The demands of the id, these desires, pushing them deeper and deeper into the unconscious. And we push, right, these desires of the id unconscious, and since we're no longer aware of them, we still sort of like project these feelings. We still have these feelings, and we project them onto a different object rather than the real object. And you're a young boy and you want to be with your mother, and you're told not to. This causes distress, and you're told no, you can't. And so instead of continue to pursue your mother, you instead project onto some other object out in the world, right, that's acceptable. And when the energy required to keep up these defense mechanisms is too much, right? Everyone deals with a little psychological stress, and sometimes you use these defense mechanisms to deal with it. Um, but you'll sometimes have psychotic reactions which manifest in aberrant behaviors. So this picture is a picture of a, I never say it right, trichotillomania, right, where people are driven to pluck the hairs from their heads, right? So these sort of um, reactions, right, are the sorts of things that Freud was. These were his patients. These were called neurotic behaviors at the time. Um, and so he thought that in order to cure the behavior, that he thinks the behavior is caused by this subconscious conflict, right? And that you need to bring these repressed feelings into consciousness, right? So the patient can understand what's going on under the surface, see what the conflict is consciously, become aware of it, and then it can resolve itself. So this is what Freud thought his job was as a therapist, right? To meet with folks that were having these sorts of problems and help them to confront what was actually going on in their unconscious. Here's an example. Little Hans, right? So here's little Hans, a little 4-year-old. He happened to be the son of a friend of Freud, and this kid developed a terrible fear of horses, right? So at the time, late 1800s, early 1900s, that's the primary mode of transportation, right? So the streets are filled with horses, right? Pulling carriages and so on. So um, kind of a problem, right? If you're terrified of horses, like, you can really go outside. He was even worried that a horse might somehow get into his bedroom and bite him, right? He was worried about horses biting him. Um, so Freud gets together with the boy, does some work, does some psychoanalysis. Some of the stuff he learns through these conversations, the boy had previously spent a good deal of time with his mother because his father was often away traveling for work. The boy, when he was afraid of the dark, right, would sleep in his mother's bed. Um, and he also learned about some episodes with horses around Hans. So he overheard someone being warned not to get too close to a horse because it might bite him, right? Um, so then the situation changes, right? Hans's father is back around the house more often, um, and he is not allowing Hans to spend as much time with his mother. Hans is not allowed to sleep in the bed with the parents anymore. Um, so there's one incident where Hans is walking with his sort of caretaker, his nanny or whatever, and he sees a horse fall down in the street, right? This scares Hans, and this seems to trigger the fear of horses, right? Right after that, now he's scared of horses all the time. And in particular, the blinders and the muzzles of horses, for some reason, seem to frighten him. So Freud's hypothesis was that Hans was going through an Oedipal crisis, right? He missed his relationship with his mother, which used to be, right, very close, and that has changed since his father is around more. Unconsciously, though, he's afraid that his father would disapprove, right? So he has to push in that desire to be with his mother down into the unconscious. Um, Meanwhile, his superego demands respect for his parents, respect for his father, right? So his ego is transferring his fear of his father onto horses, and Freud hypothesizes that the blinders and the muzzles of the horses resemble the glasses and beard of his father. Picture of a horse with glasses and beard resembling the father. So what does he do? He sits down, explains all this to the child, right? Asks the father to reassure Hans he's not angry at him. He doesn't need to be scared. And so at first, Hans becomes a little more openly defiant of his father, right, bringing this into consciousness. And then in a few months, the fear of horses goes away. Okay, so there's a story. Now let's apply our analysis, right, and see if uh, this scientific episode does in fact provide uh, support for Freud's model, or whether it doesn't, whether it's inconclusive. Right? Okay, so step one, what's the real world object of study? Well, it's Hans, right? His mind, Hans's fear of horses. Um, what is the model? Well, the model is Freud's model of psychological development, which we went over, right? That involves this Oedipal complex. It involves, right, the id, the ego and the superego, and the unconscious and conscious mind, right? All of this together. This whole story we saw about how, right, these developmental conflicts sometimes cause people to project their subconscious fears onto some other object than the actual object. Okay, so what is the prediction then? Well, the prediction is, and again, um, and I do want to talk about. I'm sorry, I pause for a moment, but I'm going to post uh, your homework assignments, right? I want to make it clear that you're being graded, the exercises, right? You're being graded entirely on uh, effort, right? So we're not going through. It would be impossible for the TAs to actually go through and carefully grade and provide comments on each homework exercise because there's going to be, like 30 of them or something, 27, something like that over the course of the course. The course. Um, So if you get full points, right, all that means is we can see you tried, right? You did your best to do the assignment. It doesn't necessarily mean that you aced it, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you did it well. Um, so hopefully you're going through these in discussion, and if you're paying attention, you're noticing where, right, when they discuss the right way to do it, you're saying, oh, I did it wrong, right? But just to clarify, because there's always a tendency for people to just see the full points and think, oh, I did it perfectly, right? Um, no, not necessarily at all, right? So what I'm going to do is one of the students did like a not a perfect job, but a very good job, right? And I'm going to sort of add a few comments to theirs. They agreed to post it anonymously, so I'm going to post that, right, so that you can sort of to remind folks that like the grade, if you get full points on your exercises, it doesn't necessarily mean you've nailed it. It just means we're glad that you're engaging. That's step one, right? You've tried. You're getting graded for doing that step, but on the exams, you're gonna have to probably do a little better than on the Okay, so oh, and the reason I was reminded of that, right, was um, being careful when you're classifying these, right? So the prediction, right, is going to involve the experimental apparatus. The model is not, right? So this conversation with Hans, right? The model doesn't mention Hans at all, right? It's just this general model of developmental psychology. The intervention, the experimental intervention, is going to be Freud's conversation with Hans, right? Hans is part of the world and he's interacting with the world. That's this experimental apparatus of how we interact with the world. That's going to come in at stage 3 in the prediction stage. Right? Okay. So Freud's prediction is, again, he's deduced from his model that if he interacts with Hans, right, interacts with the world, and um, makes Hans conscious of the conflict, right, through the psychoanalytic method, his fear of horses is going to go away. So that's a prediction. Step 4, data. So what happens? Well, after the treatment, right, Hans' fear of horses does in fact go away after a few months. Um, Okay, so step 5, is there negative evidence? Well, no. I mean, the data and the prediction pretty much agree, right? The prediction didn't say precisely when or how soon the fear of horses would go away or anything like that, so it did go away. So, yeah, no negative evidence strictly. Um, but step 6, is there positive evidence, right? So would the data have been likely to agree with the prediction even if Freud's model were not a good fit for the world? That is to say, are there other plausible models that would have yielded the same predictions? Well, this is where, right, these issues of marginal science really come up. Um, so we don't notice in a lot of these analyses so far, right, we've depended on the presentation of the scientific episode in the whatever the magazine or the newspaper or wherever you may encounter it to tell us whether there's another model, right? Um, Here they don't. They only talk about Freud's model. Um, but here I think we can use our own common sense and ask ourselves, is there another explanation of the data? So we do know that kids, right, they want attention, right? And sometimes expressing fear gives them that attention, right? So fear of the dark lets you sleep in bed with your mom, gives you more attention from your mom. Um, that's sort of natural. It's not particularly a Freudian thing, right? Um, but it didn't get him the same kind of attention from his dad, right? His dad said, no, you're not sleeping in our bed. Fear of horses did get him some attention from his dad, right? And either way, right? Another thing we know about children is they go through phases, right? Um, so whatever sort of developmental thing they're going through, right? Whatever behavior, it's pretty likely that that's going to go away within a matter of months. That's what happens with kids, right? Love their stuffed animal, they won't go anywhere without their stuffed animal, and then 3 months later they forget about it, that sort of thing. So um, not unlikely at all that the fear would have gone away anyways, right, in a matter of months because children just change radically every few months. So it's not clear, right, that the details provide strong support for Freud's model, right? It seems like it was likely that his fear of horses was going to last the rest of his life, right? He's a kid. Kids grow and kids change. They have lots of fears and overcome them. So I think it's fair to say that the results are inconclusive here, right? They didn't spoon feed us another model, but our common sense can tell us that um, we didn't necessarily need Freud's model to be able to make this prediction, right? That the kid was going to, fear of horses would eventually go away. Okay, so that's again, when we're dealing with marginal science, right? We're looking at step 6 and we're thinking um, there might be, right? It might be inconclusive. There might be other models, right? So let's look at another something that's pretty widely regarded as pseudoscience astrology. So a surprising number of people uh, believe in astrology, more than 1/3 of Americans, right? But scientists pretty much overwhelmingly regard astrology as a pseudoscience, right? But again, for the purposes of this text and this approach, we're not going to prejudge, right? We're just going to apply our analysis. And then if it comes out inconclusive, we can certainly disregard it, right, as a theory that we should pay attention to or consider true. And then it also puts it in the bucket of possibly marginal. Okay, so uh, there's people making a living at this, right? There's roughly 10,000 professional astrologers out there making a living, casting people's horoscopes, giving advice based on astrological lore, which is really ancient, right? So it comes from back in the days when the stars and the planets were associated with the gods, right? So Mars was a god of war and so on. Um, so if you think there's gods, if you think, right, the heavenly bodies are gods, then it makes sense that they can influence your life in a wide variety of ways. It was also believed that the position of the sun, moon, and the stars at the moment of your birth had some effect on your subsequent life, right? And again, you know, if these are sort of magical or supernatural things, then sure, why not? Nowadays, most scientists don't believe that the planets are gods, right? So they think that the only sorts of forces that the planets and stars could exert on you would be gravitational, but those are going to be pretty minimal, right? The moon is not doing too much. It is affecting the tides and whatnot, but certainly Mars is not exerting a great gravitational force on you. There's other forces that do come from these bodies. The sun emits radiation. That affects you, right? It burns your skin if you're outside and so on. Um, but again, not of the sort that would sort of determine the course of your life. Um, and if you ask most believers in astrology, they don't necessarily have a worked out theory of like the mechanism whereby the planets influence your life, right? What they will probably tell you is, hey, look at the predictions, right? They seem to work out, right? It makes true predictions, so that's why I believe it, right? And fair enough. Um, so let's do our analysis. So we're gonna take as an example the author of this text, right? He finds a description of like the personality characteristics of people with his astrological sign, and then a forecast for his astrological sign. Now I knew my head would be on top of this. I've got it in the text here. So first of all, his own sun sign, which is Sagittarius, um, as it represents the intended capture of unknown knowledge, wisdom, truth, and perfection in the philosophies. It represents all things dealing with higher thought, which bring people greater awareness of themselves and their place in the universe. Education, courts, religion, and literature are represented here. Well, um, not a bad description of a professor, right? Interesting. And what's his prediction for the day? Your personality will glow. You'll attract much attention with charm and pleasing ways. Make work enthusiastic, especially if it is linked with younger people. Use ingenuity and skills that are at the height of their performance. Be generous financially. Contribute to a worthy cause. Health is excellent. Travel aspects are good. Carry out a plan you know is valuable in practical ways. Love breakups are possible. Some dishonesty in another's attitude. So again, some stuff, right? Uh, right, working with younger people. That's what professors do, right? Travel certainly probably travels to conferences and stuff. So interesting. Maybe seems like some of these predictions are accurate. Okay, well, let's do the analysis. Step one, real world. What is the real world object? The analysis, the personality, attributes, and everyday actions of ordinary people. In this case, Ronald Gere, author of our text. Um, Step two, what is the model? Well, the model um, is that provided by traditional astrological theory, right, which in general terms says the positions of the sun, moon, and planets and stars at the time of people's births influence their later personalities, attributes, and everyday actions. And we don't get into the details of how astrologers, right, draw up the charts and come up with their predictions, right? I'm sure there is some formal method by which they do that. We're just assuming that they do have some, they have it, but we don't need to get into those details. 1 second. Pardon me. Right, step three, predictions. Well, we just read the predictions, right? There was a prediction about his overall personality, and then some predictions about immediate future things that will happen or what he ought to do. So, step five, is there negative evidence? Well, no. I mean, as we noted, kind of interesting, right? The predictions do sound like a philosophy professor, right? Um, so step six, on to step six, right? Which again is the crucial step when we're talking about marginal science. Um, is there positive evidence? Were the predictions likely to agree with the data, even if the models of astrological theory don't provide a good fit for the real world, right? Or again, is there another model? Um, and here we have to say, yeah, the predictions were likely to agree with the data, even if the model didn't provide a good fit. We're going to discuss that in detail in a second, right? Um, because that's the case, we should conclude that the data do not provide strong evidence for the hypotheses that make up logical theory, right? Inconclusive. Um, so why would the predictions be true regardless? Well, first of all, the predictions are vague, right? So anyone can find ways in which the descriptions fit their own life. We read sort of a whole paragraph, right? And some parts sort of screamed, "Oh, professor," right? Because it talked about right philosophy and wisdom and like that, right? But let's read Gemini, right? So he was a Sagittarius. Gemini says it's the symbol of negative and affirmative mental aspects, the combination of different ideas that are joined in an earthly and idealistic decision, an adaptable memory for facts, communication, and search for knowledge. Sounds like a professor too, right? Um, it's very general, and they say a lot. And if you just pick up a few things, you can find a way that it fits you, right? Similarly, with the everyday advice, you'll attract much attention with your charm and pleasing ways. Okay, that's sort of a prediction, right? But again, it's really vague. Attention from whom, right? If you go throughout the course of any day, you will get some attention from somebody, probably, if you leave the house, right? What sort of attention, positive or negative? Um, right? Is somebody going to honk at him on the freeway, or is someone going to tell him that they like his shirt, right? It's again very vague. Um, what are his pleasing ways? What does this mean? So, is it his good driving? Is it um, so this vagueness sort of means it could fit all manner of actual events. And they also notice they pack in a lot of different predictions, right? So if one or two sound good, then you're going to tend to latch onto those, right? Those ones that popped out that sounded like a professor, those stick in our mind, right? But maybe a lot of the other things um, didn't necessarily scream professor, right? But we just sort of didn't. We right, we'll pause for a moment for you to take the attendance quiz. Because I've had a couple emails from people that slightly annoying that you have to sort of type this out into your browser. And there's plenty of opportunity for mistakes. I found that when I post the lecture slides, you can copy and paste it from the lecture slides, and it seems to just take you right there. So that may be a better option than trying to type this in by hand. So again, if you need more time, pause it, but let's move on to the rest of the lecture, which is only another minute or so. Okay, so again, that one, astrology, again, um, there's not like negative evidence, right? The data and the prediction do agree, but the model is such that like it's not clear that that's the only way. It's not clear that the data would have been unlikely if the model were false, right? There's lots of other ways to explain the data. So we have to again say it's inconclusive, right? So I'm not going to sort of continue and do every example from the text. I feel like that would be tedious. Um, but I do want to cover this last point about the burden of proof. So, so far, these analyses have ended up inconclusive, right? The data don't provide good evidence that the model fits the world, and that's been our conclusion. Maybe you find that unsatisfying. Maybe you want a stronger conclusion and you'd like to be able to say that astrology is false, right? Um, yeah, if you're sort of hard nosed and it seems clear to you that there's no conceivable mechanism, right, whereby the stars could be affecting my life in the ways that astrology claims, you might feel like you want to say something stronger, like astrology is just false. Well, we can't, right, using our program. That's not what it's designed to do, but there's certain benefits to that, right? So first of all, it's not our job as just consumers of scientific information to determine whether a model is false. Um, and anyways, because of the burden of proof, it's not your problem, right? So burden of proof is always going to be on the person who claims their model is a good fit for the world, right? The producer of the scientific information. When we say that the data is inconclusive, that means that we can effectively treat the model as false, right? We can totally ignore it, right? Um, you don't need to worry about it when you're making decisions in your life. Um, but you also get the benefit of, like, you could leave it open, right? Maybe if you give me better evidence, I could be convinced, right? So um, that's actually the better position to be in, I think. You're not in danger of, like, proclaiming something false that turns out to be true, but you can effectively treat it as though it's false, right? And you want to make sure to remember, right, that the burden of proof is not on you. Right? People will sometimes want to shift the burden of proof onto you if they're trying to. It's not your job to prove a scientific theory wrong, right? Um, a failure to definitively refute something is not a reason to believe it. Again, if someone says, "Well, prove it's false," no, you don't have to. Again, you're lucky. You get the best of both worlds. If a model doesn't have good evidence, right, the evidence doesn't support it, you can totally ignore it. You can treat it like it's false, but you don't have to make any strong claims about it, false or true. All right, so we came in a little short, 35 minutes here. Uh, we will, again, Zoom on Monday. And I guess since I owe you a little time, I'm happy to go a little. We'll see how it goes, right? Certainly nobody needs to stay um, any longer uh, in the Zoom if they don't want to. But if it goes over 50 minutes and people still have questions or whatever, I'm happy to hang out. I do owe you about 14, 13 minutes here. So I will see you live on Monday and have a good weekend.